It was an unusually hectic Tuesday morning at the Hamilton County Courthouse. The fluorescent lights hummed irritably above, casting a cold, sterile glow on the sea of people below. Sarah Jenkins, her leather bag gripped tightly in one hand, rushed through the metal detectors, almost dropping it in her haste. Her usual calm demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a rare surge of panic. She was running late, an anomaly in her normally perfectly organized life. But today, things were spiraling out of her control. The courthouse hallways were teeming with people, their murmurs bouncing off the marble floors and columns like the echo of 1,000 whispered secrets. Sarah checked her phone once more as she hurried past, the screen flashing a reminder of the 8:45 a.m. meeting she had missed at the community center. She'd barely had time to grab a coffee, let alone change out of the clothes she'd worn for her morning volunteer shift. Her faded jeans and scuffed sneakers stood out like a sore thumb among the sea of crisp suits and polished shoes. She hadn't had time to be anything but practical today. As she approached courtroom 34, a sudden wave of anxiety washed over her. She could already hear the faint murmur of voices inside, the buzz of anticipation before the next case. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped through the heavy door, the scent of old wood and paper thick in the air. The room, with its high ceilings and imposing architecture, was suffocating in its formality. It felt as though the entire weight of the law had been placed on her shoulders the moment she entered. At the far end, Judge William Harrison sat high on his perch. The 62-year-old judge had a reputation that stretched across the county, his no-nonsense attitude and strict rulings making him both feared and respected. His silver hair gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, and his black robe seemed to swallow him whole, as though he were a figure carved out of stone. His eyes, sharp and calculating behind thin-rimmed glasses, skimmed over the case files in front of him with a practiced detachment. Case number 20047, Sarah Jenkins. Parking violation, the court clerk announced, her voice flat and indifferent, worn out from hours of repeating the same words. Sarah stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the silent judgment of strangers pressing against her skin. She tried to ignore the whispers in the gallery, the murmurs about another entitled person trying to talk their way out of a fine. But her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. The judge's eyes flicked to her, narrowing in a way that made her feel like she was already guilty. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice a sharp crack of authority. "You parked in a loading zone for over 2 hours on March 15th. The fine is $150. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah opened her mouth, her hands trembling as she gripped the podium. "Yes, Your Honor. I was unloading supplies at the East Side Community Center. We were—" Judge Harrison cut her off, his voice a whip crack of impatience. "The sign clearly states 15-minute parking only, Miss Jenkins. You were in violation. Do you have an excuse for your blatant disregard of the law?" His eyes narrowed as they scanned her casual attire, as though the simple navy sweater and faded jeans were an indication of a larger, deeper flaw. Sarah's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "I wasn't trying to ignore the rules, sir. I was volunteering. There was an emergency delivery, and—" "Excuses," he interrupted again, his tone growing colder. "If you needed more time, you should have made multiple trips or found legal parking. Not taken the shortcut." The gallery fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the court clerk paused, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Sarah felt the judge's harsh judgment like a weight on her chest. She knew it wasn't just about the parking violation. It never was with Harrison. It was about control, power, and the fact that Sarah wasn't playing by the rules he had set in his courtroom. She opened her mouth again, desperate to explain the situation. But before she could utter a word, the judge leaned forward, his face hardening. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice low and menacing, "the court's time is valuable. You've already proven your disregard for it. Given your previous violation from last year," he glanced down at the file, "I'm doubling the fine to $300. A ripple of surprise swept through the room. The murmurs grew louder, as if the entire courtroom had been holding its breath. Sarah's heart dropped. She'd known Harrison was tough, but doubling the fine? That was a punishment far beyond the crime. The court clerk glanced up, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Even the bailiff near the door shifted uncomfortably, as though sensing something was about to break. Sarah stood straighter, her brown eyes locking with the judge's, refusing to be intimidated, though every fiber of her being screamed to back down. "Your Honor, I understand the violation, but the circumstances—" "The circumstances, Miss Jenkins," Judge Harrison interjected, his voice hard as steel, "are irrelevant. You broke the law. You pay the price. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder for you to follow the rules next time." Sarah's face flushed with anger, but she held her composure. The courtroom had gone still, the silence thick with the weight of the moment. But in the back of her mind, a new thought began to form, something that hadn't crossed her mind before. Was this just about a parking ticket? Or was there something else at play here? Something more personal? Her grip tightened on the podium, the reality of the situation beginning to hit her. Was this truly about the law? Or was it about something else that Sarah hadn't yet figured out? In the future, $500, payable within 30 days. The judge's voice hung in the air, sharp and final. The silence in the courtroom deepened, thickening with a quiet judgment that seemed to settle on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She felt the weight of it press against her chest, her hands gripping the podium tighter, knuckles turning pale. It wasn't just the fine, though that stung enough. It was the casual dismissal, the fact that she had been reduced to little more than a name on a file. She had faced prejudice before, had dealt with people who judged her for her appearance or her success. But this was different. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. This was about being silenced, about being seen as less than. Her phone buzzed in her bag, the vibration muffled but insistent. It was probably another update about the upcoming board meeting or a reminder about the new software launch. But here, in this sterile courtroom, none of that mattered. In this space, she wasn't the CEO of a successful tech company or a philanthropist working hard to make a difference. Here, she was just another defendant in front of a judge who saw only what he wanted to see. Someone out of place, someone not worthy of a second thought. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't about to let him see the frustration building inside her. Slowly, methodically, she reached in her bag and pulled out her checkbook. The same checkbook she used to sign million-dollar contracts and fund community outreach programs. She had learned how to handle moments like this. It was part of her job, after all. Always be composed. Always maintain control. Judge Harrison didn't even glance up. His attention had already shifted to the next case file. "Next case," he barked, as though Sarah's presence were already forgotten, as though she were no more than a nuisance. With practiced precision, Sarah wrote the check for the $500 fine. She signed it with a flick of her pen, all the while aware of the stares from the gallery. The murmurs resumed, but Sarah didn't care. She had learned a long time ago to let people think what they wanted. Let them make their judgments. As she walked out of the courtroom, the air felt almost suffocating. But as soon as she stepped into the bustling hallway, the harsh artificial lights were replaced by the warmth of the spring sun. She shielded her eyes for a moment, adjusting to the brightness, grateful for the change in atmosphere. The noise of the courthouse felt distant now, and as she checked her phone, the world outside seemed to return to normal. 3 missed calls from her CEO assistant, 2 texts about the afternoon's investor meeting, an email about her upcoming Forbes interview. Her lips curled into a faint smile. Judge William Harrison had no idea who he had just fined, but soon he and everyone else would find out. The idea of teaching him a lesson in prejudice, in underestimating people based on appearances or assumptions, sent a flicker of satisfaction through her. She had been judged by her clothes, by her tone, by the fact that she was a woman in a world that was still too often run by men like Judge Harrison. But she was about to show him, and everyone else, that there was so much more to her than met the eye. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came from the most unexpected places. Meanwhile, Judge William Harrison sat in his chambers, leaning back in his leather chair with a sigh. He loosened his black robe, the weight of the morning's cases settling over him like a familiar fog. He sipped his 3rd cup of coffee, letting the bitter warmth wash over him as his mind replayed the morning's proceedings. Most days, the cases blurred together, speeding tickets, minor violations, petty disputes. But today was different. Something about that parking violation had stuck with him. The woman, Sarah Jenkins, had been different. Her composure was unusual. She hadn't been like the others. Most people came in with excuses, with desperation in their eyes, pleading for leniency. But Sarah, she hadn't pleaded. She hadn't made a scene. She just stood there calm, measured despite his dismissal. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His clerk, Lisa Martin, knocked softly before entering with another stack of files. Lisa had been working with him for 5 years now, and she had long since learned to read his moods. She could tell something was off today. She set the files on his desk with a quiet, practiced grace before speaking carefully. "Busy morning in court, Your Honor." Her voice was neutral, but the hesitation in her tone caught his attention. She paused, organizing the files into neat piles, then added, "That parking violation case seemed a bit harsh." Harrison looked up sharply, his expression hardening. "The law is the law, Lisa. We can't make exceptions just because someone gives us a sob story about community service." Lisa nodded politely, but her thoughts lingered on Sarah Jenkins. There was something about her, something different, that quiet strength, that composure in the face of such obvious prejudice. She didn't flinch. "Of course, Your Honor," Lisa said, though her voice betrayed a hint of doubt. Harrison stood up, moving to the window, his eyes drifting out to the crowded parking lot below. His gaze settled on the row of expensive cars mixed in with the beat-up old sedans. He was used to seeing this contrast, people with power and wealth coexisting with the less fortunate in the same space. It was a world he had grown accustomed to, a world that fit neatly into the boxes he had built for himself over the years. But Sarah Jenkins had shattered one of those boxes today, just by standing in front of him, calm and unwavering. 20 years on this bench has taught me one thing, Lisa," Harrison said, his voice quieter now, his eyes narrowing on the scene below. "Everyone has an excuse. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She had heard these words 100 times before. But today, something in the way he said them made her pause. Outside, his own Mercedes glinted in the sun, parked in its usual spot. The irony wasn't lost on her. He, the man who had just fined a woman for parking illegally, was parked in a space that was clearly marked for others. The thought lingered in the air, unspoken. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Judge William Harrison leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courthouse parking lot. His eyes briefly lingered on his Mercedes, parked in its reserved spot, a silent testament to his success. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. The son of a factory worker, a man who had put himself through law school, and a judge who had earned his position through years of hard work, discipline, and an unwavering belief in following the rules. He had always prided himself on his dedication to the law and his strict adherence to justice. The rules were the rules, and anyone who couldn't follow them had no place in his court. But today something felt different. A gnawing unease stirred in the pit of his stomach, one he couldn't quite place. His phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his daughter, Rachel. His face tightened as he glanced at the screen. "Dad, are you watching the news? You need to see this." He sighed, dismissing the message without opening it. Rachel was always sending him articles about judicial reform, diversity training, and what she called the evolving face of justice. Last week, she had begged him to attend a diversity seminar to expand his horizons. He had declined, of course. His experience was his education. The world had changed, sure, but the law hadn't. Or so he believed. "Your afternoon schedule includes 3 traffic court sessions and a meeting with the Judicial Review Board," Lisa Martin, his clerk, reminded him, changing the subject. She had worked with him for 5 years and knew when to push and when to step back. Today, she didn't need to push. Harrison had already checked out, his mind elsewhere. He nodded absent-mindedly, returning to his desk, his hand reaching for the next case file. But before he could open it, his computer chimed with an email notification. And then another, and another. His brow furrowed. He never received this many emails, especially not from the court staff. Something was off. "Miss Martinez," he called out sharply, his voice betraying his growing irritation as Lisa approached the door. "Is there something wrong with the courthouse email system today? I'm getting an unusual number of messages." Lisa, ever composed, pulled out her phone and started scanning the local news sites. Her face, usually neutral, shifted as her eyes widened in surprise. "Sir, you might want to check social media," she said carefully. "I don't bother with that nonsense," Harrison replied dismissively, waving a hand as though the very mention of social media was beneath him. In his view, platforms like Twitter and Facebook were nothing but distractions. People who thought they knew more about the law than judges like him. They only complicated matters. But before he could continue, his direct phone line rang. The caller ID flashed the name of Chief Judge Bill Thompson, and Harrison's stomach tightened. He answered quickly, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Harrison speaking. Bill, we need to talk about your morning session, specifically about Sarah Jenkins." Harrison straightened in his chair. His annoyance flared. This was about a parking ticket, for God's sake. The case was as simple as they came, a clear violation. He had ruled on it with confidence. Simple case. Clear violation. "I don't see the issue," he said, attempting to brush it off. But Thompson wasn't buying it. "She's the CEO of TechBridge Solutions, the company that just received $50 million in venture capital funding." Harrison froze, his hand still clutching his coffee cup. He blinked, trying to absorb the weight of Thompson's words. The name Sarah Jenkins hit him with a sudden force, his mind flashing back to the morning session. The young woman in the navy sweater, the calm demeanor despite his dismissiveness. The one he had dismissed so easily. She wasn't just some random defendant. She was someone important. Thompson's voice became more urgent. She was delivering educational supplies for underprivileged kids when she got that ticket bill. Harrison's grip tightened on the cup, the liquid inside now forgotten. The jarring realization hit him like a slap to the face. The young woman, the one he had dismissed with such finality, wasn't just some minor figure in a courtroom. She was someone making a real impact on the world. There was a brief, pregnant pause before Thompson continued, his voice edged with concern. "There's video, Bill. Someone in the courtroom recorded the entire interaction. It's already trending on Twitter. The headlines aren't good." Harrison's stomach dropped. He could already imagine the damage it was causing. The optics of the situation. The tough, no-nonsense judge with a reputation for being harsh, dismissing a woman who was not only a CEO, but a philanthropist trying to make a difference. The thought was suffocating. Lisa quietly placed a printout on his desk. It was an article from Forbes magazine from just last month. Harrison's eyes scanned the headline. Sarah Jenkins, revolutionizing educational technology for underprivileged communities. The photograph accompanying the article showed Sarah Jenkins in a sharp business suit, confidently smiling as she stood in front of a classroom full of eager children. She was a far cry from the young woman he had judged so quickly this morning. She wasn't just some community volunteer trying to justify her actions. She was a powerhouse, someone who had built a successful company and was changing lives, but Harrison had never taken the time to see that. "Bill, are you still there?" Thompson's voice was now distant, and Harrison realized he had been silent for too long. "Yes," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I'm here." The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him. He had not just fined a woman for a parking violation. He had underestimated her. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, had let his stubborn adherence to the letter of the law blind him to the bigger picture. He leaned back in his chair, the robes around his neck suddenly feeling too tight, too stifling. His entire world, his reputation, his career, everything he had worked for, felt as though it might come crashing down in an instant. Outside his chamber windows, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the parking lot. Harrison's Mercedes sat in its usual spot, untouched, a symbol of his success. But suddenly, he couldn't look at it without a growing sense of discomfort. His pride, his very position, had always been tied to following the rules. But today, he realized something terrifying. Sometimes, the rules were not enough. And in the case of Sarah Jenkins, he had learned that lesson far too late. Suddenly, Harrison's Mercedes seemed less like a symbol of success and more like a reminder of how far removed he had become from the people he was meant to serve. The polished exterior of the car, once a beacon of his hard-won achievements, now felt hollow in the quiet of his chambers. For the first time, he questioned whether he had lost touch with what mattered most: the people who depended on the system he had sworn to uphold. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins slid her Tesla into the reserved parking spot at Tech Bridge Solutions headquarters, the very same car she had deliberately not driven to court that morning. There had been a purpose behind it, a subtle move to avoid standing out. But now, with the video of her interaction with Judge Harrison going viral, it seemed almost laughable that she had tried to blend in. Tech Bridge's headquarters, a sleek 15-story glass building that stretched into the sky, seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight. The glass reflected the world outside, but inside, things were buzzing at an entirely different pace. Her phone hadn't stopped vibrating since she left the courthouse. Miss Jenkins, her assistant Marcus, greeted her eagerly as she stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor. His voice was laced with a mix of excitement and urgency. "The video is everywhere. CNN wants an interview. Forbes is calling for a follow-up piece, and the mayor's office left 3 messages." Sarah's steps were measured as she walked through the open-plan office, her presence commanding attention. Over 100 employees worked diligently at their desks, trying to appear absorbed in their tasks, but Sarah could feel the weight of their eyes on her as she passed. The $500 fine she had paid that morning felt almost insignificant compared to the millions she had helped raise for educational initiatives, but that wasn't the point. The point was the injustice. The point was the way she had been dismissed, reduced to an inconvenience by a man who was supposed to understand the weight of the world's inequalities. "How many views?" she asked, entering her corner office, where the city skyline stretched out before her, and the East Side Community Center, where she had been delivering laptops, was just visible in the distance. Marcus checked his tablet, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The courthouse video hit 2 million on Twitter in the last hour. People are pretty angry about how the judge treated you." Sarah stood by the window, looking out over the city. The irony wasn't lost on her. Judge Harrison had assumed she was just another rule breaker, a woman with no regard for the law. Yet her company, Tech Bridge, was helping thousands of students break free from the very societal assumptions about their potential that had nearly trapped her in a similar box. She sat down at her desk, where a framed Forbes magazine cover showed her standing proudly in front of a classroom of smiling students. The photo was from 5 years ago, back when she had been a teacher at the very same community center. She remembered watching brilliant kids struggle because they didn't have access to the technology that could help them excel. That had been the spark that ignited Tech Bridge. That had been the moment she knew that the rules had to change. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," Sarah said, her tone already shifting to business mode as she logged into her computer. "But keep the video conference with the school board. Those kids need their computers." Just then, the door to her office opened, and Dr. Patricia Wong, her chief technology officer, walked in, a tablet in hand. "The new educational software launch is trending too," Dr. Wong said, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and excitement. "People are sharing your story alongside screenshots of our program. We've gained 3,000 new signups in the last 2 hours." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The software, powered by AI, was designed to adapt to each student's learning style, providing tailored support to ensure that quality education was accessible to everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic background. It was precisely the kind of change the world needed, and, ironically, the kind of change Judge Harrison had failed to see in her. "The irony's not lost on me," Sarah said, her voice almost wistful. "The same day a judge assumes I'm just another rule breaker, my company is helping thousands of students break free from the assumptions people like and place on them." Before she could process her thoughts further, Marcus interrupted her. "Your mother's online," he said, his voice careful. He knew the relationship Sarah had with her mother was a delicate subject. Sarah picked up the phone before her assistant could say more. She already knew what her mother would say. Marie Jenkins had raised her alone, working 2 jobs to put Sarah through college. She had taught Sarah to hold her head high, no matter how others tried to put her down. "Baby, I saw the video." Marie's voice was calm, but laced with concern. "Are you okay?" Sarah smiled, leaning back in her chair as she glanced at the latest quarterly reports on her screen. "I'm fine, Mom," she replied. "Actually, I think this might be a good thing." Her mother was silent for a moment, then asked, "What do you mean?" Sarah opened her email and began typing, her fingers moving with determination. She had a plan, one that would turn this moment into an opportunity. "Remember what you always told me? Sometimes the best way to change minds is to show them what they refuse to see." Marie's laugh was soft and knowing. "And what exactly are you planning to show them?" Sarah's eyes flicked to her computer screen, where her new initiative was already beginning to take shape. "The truth." She finished typing her email and looked up at Marcus. "Send a press release," she instructed. "We're announcing a new initiative, an AI program to help identify and reduce bias in the judicial system. Free access for any court willing to implement it." The office went quiet for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. Dr. Wong raised her eyebrows in surprise. "That's not in our current development pipeline," she said, clearly taken aback. Sarah didn't flinch. "It is now." She could feel the power of the moment, the rush of possibility. The fine, the courtroom, the judge's dismissiveness. They were all just pieces in a much larger game. Sarah Jenkins was done playing by other people's rules. It was time to show them all what real change looked like. Justice for all and judicial bias now. And we demand accountability as they marched in front of the Hamilton County Courthouse. It was the first time in years that a wave of public outrage had washed over the courthouse steps with such force. The protesters chanted slogans, their voices echoing off the cold stone, their faces determined. For many of them, it wasn't just about Sarah Jenkins' parking violation anymore. It was about something deeper, something more systemic. Inside his chambers, Chief Judge Thompson sat in silence, watching Sarah's interview on his computer screen, the words she spoke reverberating in his mind. Her calm, measured response was everything his own reaction hadn't been. She wasn't seeking revenge, wasn't looking to tear down one man. She was asking for a system overhaul. Project Justice Bridge had taken on a life of its own, transforming from a tech initiative into a movement. The video was viral. The press was relentless. And for once, it seemed that the voice of the people was louder than the power of the court. Thompson looked down at the two documents on his desk. Judge Harrison's request for a leave of absence and a formal application from the court system to pilot Project Justice Bridge. Harrison had been uncharacteristically quiet since the storm began, his once steadfast position as a judge now tainted by the backlash. He'd asked for a break, no doubt to avoid further media scrutiny and avoid the inevitable conversations with his colleagues about his treatment of Jenkins. The other document, though, was more telling. It came directly from Sarah Jenkins' legal team, proposing to use her company's AI technology to detect biases within the judicial system. Courts across the nation were beginning to take notice, and Thompson knew that this wasn't something that would go away with time. This was a reckoning. Meanwhile, at TechBridge Solutions, the media storm continued to rage. Sarah stood in front of a forest of microphones, the camera flashes blinding, reporters shouting questions, their hands raised like an army of reporters demanding answers. She was calm, poised, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of pressure swirling around her. "This isn't about a parking ticket or a fine," Sarah said, her words ringing clear and sharp through the chaos. "This is about the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance and the consequences those assumptions have on their lives. Today, I'm announcing Project Justice Bridge, a new initiative to develop AI technology that will help identify patterns of bias in our judicial system." The room was alive with questions. Hands shot up from every direction. A reporter in the front row stood, eager to know the next big angle. "Miss Jenkins," the reporter asked, "will you be filing a formal complaint against Judge Harrison?" Sarah paused, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "This isn't about punishing one judge," she said, shaking her head. "It's about fixing a broken system. We're offering our technology free of charge to any court system willing to implement it. Our goal isn't to target individuals. It's to address the structural flaws that are perpetuated in the system every day." The energy in the room shifted, and the reporters exchanged glances. No one had expected Sarah Jenkins to respond like this. Not with vengeance, not with anger, but with innovation. The world was watching, and Sarah had managed to turn the narrative around in an instant. Outside the courthouse, meanwhile, Judge Harrison sat in front of his TV, still in his bathrobe, his mind struggling to process the unfolding disaster. His phone buzzed incessantly, ringing off the hook with calls from colleagues, media outlets, and his wife, who had been glued to the television since yesterday. He glanced at the Forbes magazine on the coffee table, her face staring up at him, still on the cover. That face, the one he had dismissed as a mere inconvenience, was now a symbol of something much bigger, a movement for justice, for fairness, and for accountability. Sitting next to him, his daughter Rachel looked at her father with a quiet, uneasy gaze. Her law books lay forgotten on the coffee table. "Dad," she said softly, "she's handling this with more grace than most people would." Harrison didn't reply. He simply nodded. His mind replayed the moments in the courtroom. The way he had dismissed Sarah Jenkins with barely a second thought, brushing her off as just another rule breaker with an excuse. He'd been so certain of his righteousness, but now his actions felt naive, reckless. Back at TechBridge, Sarah continued to speak into the camera, explaining the technology behind Project Justice Bridge. "Our AI system will analyze court decisions, identifying patterns that might indicate unconscious bias. It's similar to the educational software we develop for students, but this time it's focused on ensuring equal justice across every courtroom in the nation." The social media response was instantaneous. Hashtag JusticeBridge and hashtag CBias began trending worldwide, echoing the themes of fairness and accountability. Tech companies, civil rights organizations, and activists all began pledging their support for Sarah's initiative, their voices joining a chorus that demanded a more equitable justice system. Alex Chun, the tech blogger who had originally attended court for his own speeding ticket, was now sitting in his small apartment, watching his article go viral. His hands trembled slightly as he refreshed his website's traffic statistics. Over 100,000 views in just 12 hours. He felt a wave of pride mixed with disbelief. His headline had struck a chord with the public. "Local judge finds tech CEO over parking violation. A story of bias in the courts." As his article spread, the story gained traction. Alex wasn't just reporting a legal incident anymore. He was chronicling the birth of a movement. Sarah Jenkins' response to discrimination wasn't laced with anger or frustration, but with innovation and intelligence. By the afternoon, major international outlets like the BBC had picked up the story, and Sarah was being interviewed via video call. "Miss Jenkins," the BBC reporter asked, "what do you hope will come from all of this?" Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I hope that someday, when someone walks into a courtroom, they'll be judged by the truth of their actions, not by assumptions about who they appear to be." Across town, Chief Judge Thompson watched her interview, the gravity of her words sinking in. The entire judicial system was now under a microscope, and the pressure was mounting. As the protests outside the courthouse grew louder, Thompson knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but necessary. He had seen too many instances of bias in the courts to ignore it anymore. Project Justice Bridge wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. Outside, the protests continued, growing louder by the hour. The signs, the chants, the people marching, they weren't just fighting for Sarah Jenkins or even for Judge Harrison's resignation. They were demanding a reform that reached far beyond one courtroom. The court of public opinion had already rendered its judgment, and it was clear the system needed to change. Interest, his once stern expression softening as he engaged with Sarah's explanation. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken realizations. Harrison had been so sure of his own rightness for so long. But now, sitting there in the presence of the very person he had dismissed, he was beginning to see the cracks in his own understanding of justice. "This program," Sarah continued, her voice steady but passionate, "it doesn't judge you. It helps you judge better. It helps you see patterns of bias you might never have been aware of, things that shape your decisions without you realizing it." She clicked a few more buttons, bringing up case files, one after another showing inconsistencies in his past judgments. The system flagged instances where race, appearance, and even demeanor seemed to factor into his sentencing more than the merits of the case. "This isn't an attack," Sarah said, her tone now more personal than professional. "It's about giving you the tools to evolve, to be the judge you always believed you were, to see beyond your own biases, even when they're hard to face. Harrison's hand hovered over the mouse, his eyes scanning the data. He felt a sting in his chest as he read through the findings, each one a reminder of decisions he had made without ever questioning their fairness. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. The evidence was there, plain as day. "I never thought it mattered," he murmured, "the way someone looked. But these numbers," he trailed off, his throat tight. Rachel, sitting across the room, exchanged a brief glance with Sarah. She had tried to talk to him about bias for years, but only now, with this technology in front of him, did it seem to click. He had always prided himself on being fair, but fairness wasn't just about following the law. It was about understanding the human beings who came before him. "It's never easy to look at ourselves this way," Sarah said quietly. "But if we want real change, we have to face the uncomfortable truths. And then we have to be willing to act on them." Harrison nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen. The realization was dawning on him that he wasn't just facing the consequences of his actions. He was facing the opportunity for something deeper, something more transformative. He had spent his entire career holding the law up as a shield, but now he saw that the law, like every other system, could be flawed if the people enforcing it weren't constantly reevaluating their own perspectives. The room was silent for a long moment. The weight of the situation hung heavy between them. Harrison cleared his throat, the strain of his own internal conflict evident. "What do you expect from me?" he asked, his voice raw. "I've already made so many mistakes." Sarah leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. "I expect you to use your position to make things right," she said. "You can't undo the past, but you can help shape the future. Will you pilot this program with us?" Outside, the news vans remained, their satellite dishes still pointed toward the sky, a constant reminder of the storm that had followed in the wake of Harrison's judgment. But inside, in the quiet of Harrison's study, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Judge William Harrison, once an unmovable pillar of the court, was beginning to understand the power of technology, not just in solving problems, but in revealing truths. Rachel watched her father, waiting for an answer, her fingers tightly clasped together. She had always believed he was capable of more, but the weight of his pride had often made him too blind to see it. Now, finally, it seemed like her father was beginning to see past the walls he had built around himself. After what felt like an eternity, Harrison turned to Sarah. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll do it. I'll pilot the program." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Harrison, once the embodiment of judicial inflexibility, became an unlikely ally in the movement for a more equitable system. He worked closely with Sarah's team, learning how to implement the Justice Bridge AI system in the court system. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just upholding the law. He was rethinking it, reshaping it. And Sarah, through it all, remained focused on her mission. As her company continued to grow, so did her influence. But the viral video of her interaction in the courtroom had become something more than just a media sensation. It was a spark that ignited a larger conversation about systemic bias, not just in the courts, but in all institutions. Sarah didn't just want to change the way courts operated. She wanted to change the way people thought about fairness, about justice. And as she watched the early success of Project Justice Bridge in Harrison's court, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for everyone who had ever been judged based on appearance instead of actions. But the road ahead wasn't smooth. As the Justice Bridge program expanded, some judges and officials pushed back, hesitant to embrace the idea of technology analyzing their decisions. The status quo was always difficult to challenge, and even those who recognized the necessity of change were often afraid of the consequences. But Sarah's team continued to push forward, holding firm to their vision. The momentum was growing. The next phase of the program, launching nationwide, was already in the works. And while the world still watched, with the media turning every development into a headline, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't about one courtroom or one judge. It was about creating a future where fairness wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. And technology could help make that happen. As for Judge Harrison, his journey was just beginning. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. The road to redemption was long, and his mistakes couldn't be erased by one decision. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, one where he could finally make a real difference. And in the quiet of his study, as he worked alongside Sarah and Rachel, he knew that change was possible. Sarah Jenkins stood in the heart of her company's bustling office, surrounded by screens flashing data and team members working late into the night. Yet, despite the intensity of the work, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. Justice Bridge was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality that had the potential to transform the entire legal system. From the first moments of her encounter with Judge Harrison to now, the progress had been remarkable. 3 months after Judge Harrison's public apology, TechBridge Solutions had found its new home in the Hamilton County Courthouse, an unlikely but fitting place for a project that was set to reshape the judicial landscape. The courthouse, a symbol of tradition and the status quo, had become the epicenter of change. The decision to move the company's headquarters into the old courthouse wasn't just symbolic. It was a powerful statement that even the most established institutions could evolve. The Justice Bridge program was already showing tangible results. The initial data from the pilot phase was being reviewed in real time, highlighting discrepancies and patterns of bias that had long gone unnoticed. Harrison, now deeply involved in the project, sat at one of the many workstations, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he analyzed the data. "Look at this," he called out, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. "There's a clear pattern of fines varying significantly based on zip codes alone." Sarah, always focused but never too busy to engage, walked over to Harrison's station. "Let me see," she said, reviewing the statistics on his screen. The program had already flagged a 40% difference in fines for the same traffic violations, based solely on the geographic area the defendants lived in. "This is why we're here," Sarah said, her tone both firm and compassionate. "To help people see what they don't even realize is happening." The room buzzed with activity as programmers, legal experts, and community leaders worked side by side. Rachel Harrison, now officially part of the Justice Bridge legal team, was leading a training session in the corner. Watching her father, Harrison couldn't hide the pride he felt. He had worked his entire life to uphold the law, but now his understanding of that law was evolving. He had always believed in fairness, but now he was learning what that really meant. True fairness wasn't just about applying the law. It was about ensuring the law applied equally to everyone. Suddenly, the door opened, and Marcus, Sarah's assistant, entered with a tablet in his hand, excitement lighting up his face. "The governor's office just called," he said. "They want to implement Justice Bridge in all state courts, and 3 other states are requesting proposals." Sarah's eyes sparkled with satisfaction, but she didn't let herself dwell on the news. "Send them the data from our first quarter," she said. "Let's show them the results. Let's keep this momentum going." Back in the courtroom, Judge Harrison was no longer the figure he once was. He had traded his black robes for a dark blue suit, and he was standing at the podium, the same place where countless defendants had stood before him. This time, however, he wasn't in judgment of others. He was asking for judgment of himself. "I've spent 20 years behind that bench," Harrison began, his voice steady but with a gravity that reflected the weight of what he was about to say. "I thought I was serving justice, but I wasn't seeing the whole picture." He paused, looking out over the crowd. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras focused on him. But this wasn't just another public apology. This was a reckoning. "Last week, I fined Miss Sarah Jenkins for a parking violation without giving her a fair chance to explain herself. I made assumptions based on her appearance. I was wrong." The audience shifted, some surprised, some nodding, as the chief judge leaned forward, listening closely. This wasn't the standard scripted apology his office had prepared. Harrison had insisted on speaking from the heart. "But this isn't just about one mistake," he continued. "For 20 years, I've probably made the same mistake countless times. I've looked at people and decided their story before they could tell it." His eyes flicked to Sarah, seated in the front row. "Miss Jenkins could have used this incident to demand my resignation," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Instead, she showed me a better way forward." A hushed silence fell over the room. Harrison's words were met with a quiet nod of acknowledgement from Sarah, her eyes meeting his. The truth he had been reluctant to face for so long was now impossible to ignore. "I'm announcing today that I'll be taking a temporary leave from the bench," he said, causing a ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. "During this time, I will be working with TechBridge Solutions to help develop and implement their Justice Bridge program." The cameras flashed as Sarah stood, joining him at the podium. "Judge Harrison will serve as our judicial consultant," Sarah announced, her voice calm and authoritative. "His experience, and yes, his mistakes, will help us create better technology to prevent bias in our courts." The reporters' hands shot up, eager to ask their questions, but Harrison raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished yet. "I'm also enrolling in a comprehensive bias training program," he said, "and I'm requesting that it become mandatory for all judges in our district." He turned to face his fellow judges in the audience, his voice cracking slightly. "We can't serve justice if we're not willing to face our own prejudices." Outside the courthouse, news helicopters circled overhead, and protesters held up signs reading "Justice should be blind" and "Technology for change." But the true story was happening inside the courtroom, as a judge once so entrenched in tradition and authority was now asking for help to be better. The applause that followed was not just for Harrison's words. It was for the tangible change that was beginning to take root. Sarah Jenkins, the woman he had once dismissed so easily, was now standing beside him as a symbol of how conflict could spark revolutionary change. "Ready for this?" Sarah asked quietly, as they faced the media crowd. "Ready," Harrison replied, his voice firm, yet full of humility. "It's time to bridge the gap between who we are and who we should be." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the TechBridge Solutions office, now located in the very courthouse that had once symbolized the old system of justice. The Justice Bridge program had already made significant strides. Judge Harrison, sitting at one of the workstations, was reviewing real-time case data. He had quickly become an invaluable part of the team, his legal expertise and willingness to learn making him an ideal ally for the project. As Harrison pointed out another pattern of bias in traffic violations, Sarah walked over to his desk, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "The difference in fines," he said, pointing to the screen, "is significant. This is exactly why we're doing this." At the same time, Rachel Harrison, now officially part of the team, was leading a training session for the new hires, teaching them how to analyze the data from a legal perspective. The room was abuzz with energy, but there was a sense of purpose in the air. Everyone knew that this work wasn't just technical, it was deeply human. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her mother. "I just saw you on the morning news. They're calling Justice Bridge a revolution in the legal system. Your father would be so proud." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she wiped them away. Her father, who had died when she was young, had taught her to fight against systemic inequality. Now, her work was starting to make the changes he had always dreamed of. "All right, everyone, gather round," Sarah called out, her voice full of excitement. "I've just received word that the Supreme Court Justice will be visiting next week to see our program. They're considering implementing it at the federal level." A cheer went up from the team. The impact of Justice Bridge was snowballing. What had started as an initiative for a local court was now becoming a revolutionary movement that could change the entire legal system. "We're not just writing code or analyzing data," Harrison said, his voice rich with the wisdom of experience. "We're changing how justice works in this country." As Sarah looked at the work they were doing and the community that had rallied behind them, she realized that this was just the beginning. True change wasn't just about fixing one system. It was about remaking the entire structure. And with Justice Bridge, they were on the path to do exactly that. 6 months later, the once quiet corners of the Hamilton County Courthouse were now a hub of learning and progress. Thanks to the support of TechBridge Solutions, the courthouse had become home to a fully equipped computer lab, a space dedicated to bridging the gaps between technology and the legal system. Judge Harrison volunteered there every week, teaching kids about the law and, more importantly, listening to their stories. These were the voices he once failed to hear, the voices he now understood he needed to listen to. As Sarah stood before a new group of Justice Bridge team members, she reflected on how far they had come. 6 months ago, she said, addressing the room, I stood in court feeling powerless because someone judged me without knowing me. She gestured to the computers, the teams, and the future they were building together. Now, we're making sure that story doesn't repeat itself. Harrison, standing beside her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're not just building bridges, he said, his gaze sweeping across the diverse faces in the room. We're building a new path to justice. 1 year after the parking ticket incident, the Hamilton County Courthouse buzzed with excitement. Banners reading National Justice Bridge Conference hung in the marble hallways, and the main courtroom, once the site of countless trials, had been transformed into a conference hall. Judges, tech experts, and legal professionals from all 50 states filled the room, eager to learn about the Justice Bridge program's national impact. Sarah Jenkins took her place at the podium where she had once been fined, now standing with confidence and purpose. Dressed in an elegant business suit, she smiled warmly as she addressed the crowd. Behind her, a large screen displayed the Justice Bridge program's nationwide impact. Over 200 courts had adopted the program, with a 50% reduction in biased decisions and over 1 million cases analyzed. 1 year ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and powerful. I stood in this very spot, being judged by appearances. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. Today, I stand here with proof that technology and compassion can transform our justice system. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat next to his daughter, Rachel, both now key figures in the Justice Bridge movement. Harrison's hair had grown grayer over the year, but his eyes glowed with a newfound wisdom. He had spent the last year traveling across the country, sharing his story and helping courts implement the program. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she switched to the next slide. Our latest data shows that courts using Justice Bridge have significantly reduced disparities in sentencing. But she was quick to remind the crowd that numbers alone couldn't capture the full impact. The real change is in the lives touched, she said. The screen behind her changed to show video testimonials, stories from people who had experienced fair treatment because of the program. A young mother spoke about receiving fair treatment in a custody case, and a teenager described how a judge had given him a second chance after understanding his circumstances. These stories, Sarah said, are what truly define the success of Justice Bridge. In the audience, Sarah's mother wiped away a tear as she watched her daughter speak. Beside her sat Lisa Martinez, Harrison's former clerk and now the program's chief training coordinator. The courthouse staff, once steeped in tradition, had evolved along with the times, proving that change was possible at every level of the system. And now, Sarah continued, smiling broadly, I'd like to introduce someone who has become both a partner and a friend, Judge William Harrison. Amid thunderous applause, Judge Harrison walked to the podium, his transformation from a symbol of bias to a champion of change making headlines nationwide. A year ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like, he began, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything he had learned. I was wrong. Justice isn't about what we think we see. It's about what we take the time to understand. The crowd listened in rapt attention, knowing that the words coming from this man were not just the words of a judge. They were the reflections of someone who had evolved from a place of ignorance into one of enlightenment. In the back of the room, tech bloggers live-streamed the event. Lee Chun, whose original article had helped spark the movement, typed furiously on his laptop. His latest headline would read, "From viral moment to national movement, Justice Bridge's first year." Sarah returned to the podium, standing beside Harrison, a look of satisfaction on her face. Today, we're announcing the next phase of Justice Bridge, she said. Through a partnership with major law schools, we're introducing bias detection training for all future judges and lawyers. As the crowd erupted in applause, Rachel stood up, holding a thick folder. The Supreme Court has just approved our program as a mandatory requirement for all federal courts, she announced, her voice firm with the weight of the news. And the American Bar Association is incorporating our training into their ethics requirements. The room erupted in another wave of applause. The chief judge, who had witnessed it all from the beginning, nodded in satisfaction. His courthouse, the one where Judge Harrison had once handed down a biased decision, had now become ground zero for a national transformation in justice. But our work isn't finished, Sarah said, her voice growing impassioned. Every day, people walk into courtrooms across this country hoping to be seen for who they really are. Our technology can help, but the real change comes from people willing to look past their first assumptions. Harrison stepped forward one last time. A year ago, I find this remarkable woman because I couldn't see past my own biases. Today, I thank her for helping me, and all of us, see justice in a new light. As the conference continued, Sarah slipped away to the quiet of her old office in the courthouse's tech center. On her desk sat two framed items: the original parking ticket that had started it all, and a recent letter from a young girl who wrote, "Because of Justice Bridge, the judge listened to my story." Through her office window, Sarah watched as new faces entered the courthouse. People from all walks of life, each with their own story, now had a better chance of being heard. Thanks to one parking ticket and the changes it had inspired, justice was no longer just a concept. It was becoming a reality for everyone who needed it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Harrison. "Ready for tomorrow's training session with the new judges?" "Ready," she typed back, smiling. There are always more bridges to build. And so, as the Justice Bridge program continued to spread across the nation, Sarah knew that the path they had started on was just the beginning. There would always be more bridges to build, more lives to touch, and more stories to be heard. But now, with each passing day, the possibility of true justice, for all, was within reach.